Sasha Demo, and this is Crash Course History US. And today, we're going to be talking about the educational reform movement. The public education movement of the antebellum period drastically changed American society by starting to equalize opportunities for diverse groups of people and giving rise to the increased rate of technological advancements in America up to the present day. Hey, have you read this book about the infinite potential of the individual?
I haven't read that book because I can't read because I've never been to school.
Why don't you better yourself by getting an education?
I have to work on the farm all the time and I don't have time, and I also can't afford an expensive private school, so I'm gonna steal your money.
Hey!
Whoa there, I'm Horace Mann, and I think we should teach our young people to be enlightened, better citizens. The only way we can do this is public education.
So as you can see, in the South, many farmers didn't have enough money to pay for an education because they spent most of their money providing just for themselves and for their family to survive. So mainly wealthy plantation owners and like middle class citizens, like upper middle class citizens, actually had enough money to pay for private schooling and or a private tutor to come to their home. But in the South, slaves were not permitted to really get an education, so they didn't have any educational opportunities unless their owner actually wanted them to learn to be literate, which was pretty rare. In the North, the industrial economy began to expand rapidly in the 1820s, and basically this divided the home from the workplace. So now people would go to factories to work, and at home they just spend time with their family. But this meant that like kids had more time on their hands to get an education, but at the time that opportunity wasn't really available, and it only really started expanding in 1837 during the panic, when the poverty rate began to increase and the crime rate began to increase. And this is when Horace Mann argued that universal public education was the best way to turn unruly children into disciplined, judicious Republican citizens. And another thing that really brought about change was the belief of transcendentalism and romanticism, which was the new belief in the innate capacity of every person and of society's obligation to tap that capacity. But it was also a reflection of the desire to expose students to social values as a way to resist instability. In antebellum America, many different reform movements were beginning to take off. In this period, people felt that there was a lot of chaos and destruction, so they began to take desperate measures to gain control. There were lots of different regional, religious, and social groups in the nation which had varying outlooks on educational reform, and certain areas were more advanced technologically than others, which all affected the degree of the expansion of the movement to become what we know school as today.
Public education really began to take off in the 1830s. New schools and universities popped up everywhere, especially in Massachusetts. This sudden change was in part caused by the Romanticist desire for stability in society and its belief in individual ability for achievement. Massachusetts was the first state to begin to develop a comprehensive public education system by appropriating state funds to support schools. Pennsylvania did the same in 1835, and New York in 1840. By the 1850s and 1860s, most states had some form of tax-funded education, but they were not all equally effective. In the states that had first established education, which tended to be in the North, teachers were usually better educated and funding was better. In southern and especially western states, however, teachers sometimes weren't very educated themselves and many students didn't go regularly or at all, even though southern states were at least equal to northern states in terms of private, higher-level education. As a result, although public education was supposed to equalize opportunities for different classes of people, poor children in the South were pretty hard-pressed to attend school at all, and of course slaves were completely excluded from the public education system. However, public education reform did elevate opportunities for all groups of Americans. Public schools specifically for free blacks or children of slaves were founded in this period. One such school was the African Free School No. 2, whose alumni included Henry Highland Garnet and James McCune Smith, and other African Americans who went on later to advocate for abolition and attend private universities that allowed African Americans to attend, such as Lincoln and Wilberforce University. Public schools also often allowed women to attend. The inclusion of these groups of people in public education opened the door for their participation in higher education. Many universities, such as Vassar College, Wellesley College, and Smith College, began allowing women to attend, and ultimately furthered the women's and slaves' rights movements of the time by educating their most important members. This trend continued after the Civil War as well, and snowballed up to the modern day. Native Americans also felt the winds of change. Missionaries and other whites set up public schools for Native Americans in the West because they thought they could quote-unquote civilize them. Overall, education both raised overall levels of well-being and equality for diverse groups of people and raised material standards of living by helping society advance technologically. It's as our friend Horace Mann said, "Education is a great equalizer of the conditions of men. It does better than to disarm the poor of their hostility towards the rich. It prevents being poor." It's no wonder that with increasing opportunities and greater frequency of public education in America came advancements in technology. The Industrial Revolution took place around the same time as the education reform movement and produced the train, the steamboat, iron smelting, improvements in architecture, the telegraph, and many more innovations. New schools were created that specialized in medicine, science, and other technological fields. And where did this all start? It started with education, which started with public education, which started with reform in the antebellum period in America.
Hi, I'm Julia, and it's time for the Mystery Doc. There were so many different activists in the public education reform movement. There was Governor William Seward of New York, who helped extend public support for education. And then there was Noah Webster, who created popular textbooks, spellers, and dictionaries. And there were even whole states like Rhode Island and Connecticut that made so many legislative moves towards the public education reform movement and who helped the movement progress overall. Time for the Mystery Doc.
In the early steps towards the formation of correct habits, it is necessary that until the power of self-guidance is obtained, the pupil should be constantly under the eye of a master, not disposed to exercise authority so much as to give an advice. Before the habit of self-direction is formed, it is therefore pernicious to leave much time at the disposal of the pupil. Proper intellectual and moral aims must be inspired, and the pupil must attain a knowledge of the mode of employing his time with skill usefully and under the guidance right motives ere he can be properly left to the spontaneous suggestions of own mind. Here, therefore, the moral and the intellectual training are in closest harmony.
This could probably be Horace Mann, aka the father of American public education, but that would probably be too obvious. Mann was truly the man.
He drastically changed the Massachusetts education system and was the largest figure in the public education reform movement. As Massachusetts Secretary of the Board of Education, he reorganized the school system, doubled teacher salaries, and made the school year longer and more cohesive. Mann took huge steps towards gaining state-sponsored elementary schools. Without his efforts, the U.S. would not have had the elementary school system and high literacy rates that it had by 1870. He believed that education was the key to democracy and should be paid for by the people. He also thought that teachers should know their craft to effectively teach the children. He supported positive reinforcement over beatings, educating children of all classes, and even age grading, which is a system where different ages are assigned to different grades. He thought that education could be non-sectarian, although not non-religious, and should teach more than the R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Another person this could be is McGuffey. McGuffey wrote McGuffey's Reader, which was an extremely popular textbook used widely in schools. McGuffey's Reader taught English lessons as well as moral values and patriotism. But then again, there's Bronson Alcott, the father of Louisa May Alcott, a transcendentalist who created Fruitlands, an experimental school in which children learn self-realization through teaching themselves and learning from their own wisdom rather than self-imposed societal views. Okay, my final answer is Bronson Alcott.
False.
What? Henry Barnard, Secretary to the Connecticut Board of Education, Commissioner of Schools in Rhode Island, President of St. John's in Maryland, First Commissioner of Education in the U.S., Henry Barnard. I guess it's time for the shock pen.
All around me are familiar faces, worn out.
After feeling miserable as a boy, he caused for better supervision of schools through passing an 1838 Act, organized teacher institutions, and worked for better legislative work on education. He, like Horace Mann, believed in teaching children moral values through school. Although many men were strong advocates for better public education, women like Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman to graduate medical school, Mary Jane Patterson, who was the first woman to receive a bachelor's degree, and even authors like Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women, all helped break glass ceilings and create progress for everyone in terms of education and gender equality. Without these men and women's efforts to expand not just education, but opportunity for children to change their places in society, we wouldn't be as technologically advanced as we are today.
It's weird to think that what started as this became this in less than 200 years. One of the most significant developments over the span of 2 centuries was the introduction and later advancement of technology. However, when most people couldn't even attend school at the time, creating a pop socket wasn't the greatest concern. Starting from the early 19th century, states began creating reforms, expanding on the limited amount of education offered to people, but didn't get too far. Then, in 1918, all states had laws requiring mandatory school attendance for children through elementary school. In just 100 years, free public education became offered to all, creating a lasting impact that obviously affects us still today. With the creation of free public schools came a place to learn about things your parents are either too lazy or too uncomfortable to talk to you about, such as the birds and the bees. Soon after schools were created, sexual education began being taught in 1920, a class we now call health. Additionally, an event we're all familiar with is the launching of the Sputnik satellite by the Soviet Union in 1957. Because of the undeniable tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, this big step into the math and science world by the Soviet Union instilled fear into the minds of many American scholars. This resulted in the funding of over $1 billion to revamp math and science curricula into the new public American schools. What followed was a long journey in establishing the other aspects of technology into what we have today. Think about all the classroom appliances that are available to us today. Computers, phones, projectors, and so much more. Now, you may think this is because of a few outstanding individuals such as Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, who came up with an idea that revolutionized the world. However, it is actually everyone in society that made this difference. Because of the developments in what schools were teaching and the depth to which they were taught, society as a whole became more intellectual. As everyone began expanding their knowledge of English, math, science, and other languages, both private and public education developed alongside them. Basically, because people were getting smarter, the intricateness of technology was getting smarter, you could say, too. What's this? Did you say the Jim Crow laws? Well, that is correct. Now, although technology was arguably one of the most noticeable developments since the 19th century, things like race and gender in school changed drastically as well. Obviously, now we live where we can drink from the same fountains and be in the same classrooms as people of all races, and both genders can learn the same thing in classrooms. As seen in many schools today, the equality given to people of all shapes and sizes result in the diverseness in all aspects in many schools. This also led to the increased advancement of technology, showing how, in some way, everything affects each other and builds our society to where we are today.